first time, but it's going to be okay. Hello, good morning, dear GCLOGers. We are really looking forward to preparing a lot of things for you. And today, this is a very special occasion because I have the presence of my dear friend and colleague, Leonard Morrison. Actually, as you know, this is the resume webinar. And because we are not experts on career development or in preparing resumes, well, we needed someone who is really an expert. And Len has a very good career on that. He has led this and worked on this for how many years, Len?
Over 20.
Wow, you can imagine how much experience this guy has. So, of course, it's a pleasure to have you here. And just to give you an idea, well, by the way, just for the record, this is not my voice, right? So I'm a bit sick. But, well, coming back to the point, he has been working in job placement and job positioning for the students and in student engagement for, well, this quantity of years. But he has worked with thousands of students in different universities during his career. So as you can imagine, Len is a very important person, and he will be helping us with this resume webinar. So we hope that with this webinar, you can have the tools to prepare yourself, to sell yourselves in front of the hirers and also the people who can be your employer. And well, of course, Len cannot be alone, and then Ileana is going to be helping us. You already know Ileana, so I want to welcome both of you. Thanks again, Len, for your help with this webinar, and we hope that you can enjoy this. Okay, guys? Looking forward to seeing you soon. Okay, so I let you in the stage, so let me welcome
Thank you, Chris.
Len. Thank you.
I appreciate it.
And also Ileana.
Yes, I look forward to sharing this information with you. It's quite important. The resume is your calling card. It could be the first impression that you make for those individuals whom you have not met yet. So we're going to cover a fair amount of information today. I want to make sure my mic is on here.
Yeah.
Don, can you hear me? Okay, great. So we are going to cover a fair amount of information here, and I encourage you to email me questions. They'll be forwarded, and I will make certain that I do address them. First, I do want to cover, generally, the purpose of the resume, which is really to tell your story. We'll move on to we'll move on to what the strategy is, relevance, formatting, ultimately the placement component, and we will have time at the end to focus on the cover letter as well. So, without further ado, up to the resume, frankly, is to tell your story, to tell it in the most accurate light, but also in the most favorable light. And it's quite important that it be very relevant to the role that you're targeting. I do think it's important to make the distinction. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Sorry, guys.
So we'll switch. Okay.
If you can just use that one in there.
Leave it there. So hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the purpose of the resume is really to tell your story. I do want to compare it with the CV, which most of you would be familiar with. Perhaps the most important distinction is with the U.S. resume, it's to get the interview. It's typically shorter. The resume that you're preparing is for a resume book. So you've seen the template. You've probably prepared a draft by now. At least Chris is expecting you to have completed the draft and to send it in. It'll go in a book. Generally, one-page resume in the book. It's very focused. It does not reflect your entire career. And that's a big distinction between a U.S. resume and a CV. There's a lot of information that will not be included in a U.S. resume. For example, your marital status, your age, religion, height, weight, number of children, all that personal information is not included in a resume. So really, under no circumstances should that be included in a US resume. And that's something that's quite different than a CV. I also recommend multiple versions of a resume. So for example, you probably have a very long CV, which is fine. I frankly recommend that you include in your CV every experience that you've done. What we're going to talk about today is how you selectively pull relevant experiences from the CV and incorporate those into the US resume. And when I mean selective, we're only going to pull those experiences, those skills, those relevant, perhaps technical tools that are going to be important to the next reader of the resume. So in that way, the resume is a forward-looking document. It should appeal to the role that you're targeting. It does not list everything that you've ever done. That's the biggest distinction. Something else to keep in mind, and that is that, and actually, let me take a break for a moment here because Ileana, my colleague from Bulgaria, and you're probably familiar with the CV, correct?
Yes, definitely. As someone who is originally from Bulgaria, it's very important to make the difference between the CV and the resume and make sure to always make them be completely different. For example, in Europe, on the CV, you should put your picture and you can have up to 3 pages. But in the US, you definitely should not do that. Remove your picture, make sure it's 1 page. Do not put any personal information. So yes, as international students, it's very important to consider those differences.
That's an excellent point. And you've probably heard that resume readers spend very little time reviewing the resume. That's true. If an individual is actually reading your resume as part of the screen, more likely today in the US and perhaps outside of the US, employers are using applicant tracking systems to scan the resume before it even gets viewed by a human. And they're doing this because they're receiving such a high volume of resumes. It's a very efficient way to screen out candidates who are not appropriate for the role. And these applicant tracking systems focus on keywords. Keywords that the employer has identified are absolutely critical to the role. So it's important for you as you identify and craft a resume to tailor it to the position that you're applying. What are the skills that they're looking for? Make sure those skills are in the resume. What are the particular certifications that might be required? The years of experience, the industry. Those types of references can support your candidacy. Those should be in the resume and relevant to the role. That way they'll get picked up by the applicant tracking system. So, to reiterate here, the resume is a very factual document. It's one that highlights your experience in the most positive way, but also in the most accurate way. The cover letter, which we'll talk to later on in the presentation, is much more about persuading the employer to select you. So it's the opportunity to show your enthusiasm in a more creative way. With that, I will move on to the importance of relevance. And here I would recommend that before you craft your resume or before you modify it for a position, find out what excites you about the position that you're applying for. This allows you to identify what your competitive advantage is. So for example, if it's a technical role and you're analytically inclined and you have relevant experience in that domain, in that industry, or in that function, those might be 3 buckets that you want to make sure are included in the resume: technical, quantitative, from the same industry. So again, this is a suggestion on how to read a job description and pull from the job description what you know that employer is looking for. Tailor those accomplishments and those achievements to the role that you're applying for. Ideally, you want that employer to read your resume and to begin to circle the key transferable skills that you have. So make it easy for the recruiter. And I think keeping it simple, keeping it to 3 makes sense. Would you agree, Ileana?
Yes, I definitely agree on that.
So here's an example of what I would call a crisp, professional-looking one-page resume. Notice the formatting. There's not too much white space, but it is complete. Full to the margins, dates on the right, education at the top, and the experience is bulleted, but not too bulleted. Skills, additional expertise is indicated at the bottom. It's fairly simple. It's clear. There's not a lot of font that's too creative. There's not a lot of inappropriate use of parentheses or italics. Read through it, and I think you'll get a sense that this is a very professional-looking resume. The thing that I want to alert you to is the experience of MIT. Notice how it's referred to as MIT Global Scale Network. That is exactly how you should frame your experience on the resume. Word for word, with a different date, perhaps. It's in reverse chronological order, with the most recent educational experience first at the top, followed by your earlier academic achievements. But this is also an opportunity here to include relevant coursework. So under your academic experience, you could add a line, relevant coursework. What I mean by relevant is it's relevant to the next employer. So whatever that employer is looking for, highlight or cherry pick those core classes, 1 or 2 or 3, that will appeal to the next recruiter. Excuse me. Additionally, you could also include a capstone or a thesis project. Certainly, that becomes the culminating achievement of your academic experience. I would certainly include it. It's a talking point in an interview, probably not something I would leave off. However, if you have a lot of experience, the study abroad from your undergraduate years might be removed. We have a question?
Yes. Why should educational experience go on top?
Well, that's an excellent point, because often individuals with significant work experience, and I mean 10 years, would put experience at the top. In this case, it's for a resume book. So the template that we're following is one that requires that consistency, because that's what employers are looking for. That's not to say that if you're applying for an opportunity outside of this domain that you could not include experience. I have 30 years experience. I'm not going to lead with my education. I'm going to lead with experience at the top of my resume. But for the purpose of the resume book, we are requiring that education be at the top. Thank you, and keep those questions coming. So as we look at contact information, if you'll notice on the screen, it's on 2 lines. This is an opportunity to conserve space. It gives you more space to write about your experiences and about your achievements. Notice that the name is the largest font. It should be the largest, not too large. It should also be bolded. Contact information, use your mit.edu email. Certainly something that's very professional, very crisp. If you wish to use the line, which I recommend, it does separate it from the rest of the resume. As we move on to education, notice again that it's reverse chronology. The most recent at the top. If you're currently in the program, you have a choice. Expected graduation date of May 2019 is certainly appropriate. Alternatively, you could indicate that you are a candidate for a Master of Business Administration or candidate for a particular degree. Either of those is the way to frame it while you're currently a student. Under experience, we're leading with the company, followed by the location of the employer, with the dates on the right side of the page. Beneath the company is the title. Most recent title should be bolded. Now, some of you may be working for an organization that is not a prominent, well-known firm. It might be a private company. In those instances, it's certainly appropriate to provide a brief one-sentence, one-line description of the organization. A privately held manufacturer of X. That does give the reader an indication of what business your employer is in. So even though it's not listed here, right after or underneath ABC Bank, for example, you could indicate a $7 billion savings and loans serving the regional market of upstate New York. A brief, succinct description.
And we have a few more questions. Should teaching experience go along with educational experience?
I think that depends. In some cases, in most cases, I think it may, because it would indicate to the reader that you have expertise in the particular content area. So I would consider putting it up there. Alternatively, if your teaching experience was outside of your the domain in which you're targeting employment, you might want to keep it under professional experience rather than education. So if it does strengthen your knowledge and understanding of the domain, I would keep it up.
And the other question is, should we keep the font you propose?
I would keep the font of the relatively 11 or a 12 font. Yes. Again, if it's too large, you're using up too much space. If it's too small, employers are not going to want to read it if it's a 10. I think that's too small. So 11 or 12 generally would be appropriate. Notice the dates. Let's keep them simple. You have 3 choices. Doesn't matter which you choose as long as you're consistent.
And a few more questions.
Yes.
Should we add GMAT score?
Good question. I have seen GMAT score added. If it is sufficiently high, and I leave that up to you, it does indicate certainly higher aptitude, and it can distinguish your candidacy. So I'm not opposed to that at all.
And may the candidates include awards they've received?
Absolutely. So awards, particularly if they're academic awards, can go underneath education. Alternatively, you could add at the bottom of the resume awards and recognition.
And should I add 2 addresses, for example, one in China and one in Brazil, or just stick to one?
So again, this becomes a choice. If there is one primary address that you cell phone and address where you would expect to be contacted, one is certainly appropriate. However, if you're based in one country but look to work in another country where you've lived in the past or where you expect to live, where you have a residence, then indicate both, because the employer will now know that you have this other address, and maybe that's near where their headquarters is, or where their plant is, or where the job opening is. So that to me is a big plus. Employers will see that address and say, well, this is someone who may stay with us for a while.
For example, someone took an online virtual master's program. How should they reference that?
That would also go under the education section. I would indicate that if it's a degreed program, indicate that it was a degreed program, highlight the university. If the question is, should it be highlighted that it was virtual, generally I say that it should be, because if not, the next reader of the resume would look at your dates of employment and see the dates in which you were enrolled, and they might not understand how you are able to do both, particularly if the academic institution is in a different location than your work location. So I would indicate that it is perhaps a hybrid program or an online program. A lot of this we can go over when you send your resumes in, so we can refine it. But again, as we move to experience, you'll notice on the resume that was presented that there are bullets, and the challenge is balancing bullets and paragraphs. I would not recommend a large number of bullets, but rather take the experience itself, craft, and we're going to get to this further on in the presentation, craft the experience so that it is distinct from others within the same employer, and bullet each. It just makes it easier to read, and that's what's most important. Bullets make a resume easy to read. Of course, every experience will be in the past tense, so check your verb choice throughout. A common error or common mistake that many students make is that when they're creating a resume, they list tasks from their job description. They may list responsibilities. In fact, they may even say responsible for. Well, frankly, saying responsible for doesn't mean that you actually completed it. So try to take the approach of highlighting achievements, highlighting accomplishments, only those that are relevant to the role that you're applying for. And we're going to talk about this, the importance of transferable skills. You want that employer to read that resume and to start to circle what they find most appealing. You're going to see achievements as well. You're going to highlight your achievements, and you're going to try to quantify those achievements 3 ways: dollar volume, margin, or quantity. The key takeaway from this slide is the relevancy of the experience to the role, and that it highlights the transferable skills that you know that next employer wants. And I have a suggestion on the next slide, which will show you how to achieve that. Do we have additional questions? Okay.
What do you think about adding a link to a LinkedIn profile?
I think that's absolutely appropriate. The LinkedIn profile is something that will give the employer another view of you, something that's somewhat less formal. It gives insight into your personality. You can be somewhat more expressive in a LinkedIn profile. It'll share insight also into your professional connections, your network. That's absolutely appropriate.
And what if I'm not aware or sure about the exact monetary value of a business, but know the amounts of weights I have handled?
If you're not sure of the monetary value of a business, then you may wish to quantify the business in a different way, perhaps by saying the 3rd largest exporter of X, one of the region's most prominent brands. There are different ways to frame it. What I recommend is going on the site of the employer, typically under news, and you'll see how the public relations department captures that business. And usually you can just lift a few lines from what the PR department, and they're very well versed in capturing that information and using that as a way to describe the business.
And should I remove experience abroad if I need to make the resume shorter? How can I show the company that I have this experience? Should I mention languages instead?
Well, you have to make the assumption that how important is it to the employer to know that you studied abroad? That's the most important fact. Clearly, languages are important. I think competency in a language is far more valuable than having studied abroad for a semester. So if you are in tight need of space, absolutely remove study abroad. And for many of you with a lot of experience, your study abroad experience could have happened 5 or 6 or 7 or more years ago, so it becomes less relevant.
Where would you emphasize the particular field to which you're applying?
Where would I emphasize the particular field that I'm applying? So maybe that question is about the objective. I'm making an assumption here because there are some resumes where students ask about should I have an objective on the resume? And generally, I say no, because the resume is going to be accompanied by a cover letter, and it's within the cover letter that you would target the particular industry. But it should, ideally, you want to use enough jargon and phrases that are known to the industry so that reader would have a sense that you know their business. So maybe you're able to reference clients that you interacted with or that you had relationships with that were in their industry. Or maybe you're using terminology in the resume that the reader understands is similar to their industry.
And what do you think about including a GPA on the resume?
If it's a really high GPA, I would include it. If it's not, definitely don't include it.
That's all for now.
Okay, great. Keep them coming. These are excellent questions. Action verbs. So again, it's important that you have a sense of what the focus will be of your resume. I can't repeat this enough. It has to be relevant to the role that you're targeting. Once it is, you can use appropriate action verbs that are tied to it. So if you'll notice at the bottom of this page, there's a link. If you go to that link, you will find verbs that are aligned with particular functions. So for example, if you're pursuing a technical role and you have a technical experience, these are examples of verbs that you can use that will strengthen your experiences and your accomplishments. If you are in a communications role, you'll find verbs that strengthen that type of a function that you had. The same with those of you who are in analytical roles. It's a great site to help you use phrases that are more impactful, that are more meaningful, that are more powerful. Obviously, action verbs are important, but we don't want to repeat them. So this gives you a chance to provide a little bit of variety. And again, as I mentioned, responsible for that's not an action verb. Worked with, not strong. You didn't work with, collaborated with, partnered frequently with. So again, that choice of action verb is really important.
If the benefits, the results haven't been quantified, is it possible to put the benefits in qualitative form?
Absolutely. And in some cases, it's very hard to quantify your achievements. And I don't want to give you the impression that you should try to quantify every single achievement on the resume. That's not important. I've seen a lot of that. I think it is distracting. And for example, it could raise some questions. How is that person able to quantify every single achievement by X% or X dollars saved? I think it can raise more doubts. So where you're able to truly quantify, and honestly, in an interview where you're able to go into much more depth, I would choose to quantify. But remember, everything you put on the resume is fair game in the interview. If you write it down, they will drill deep on it and ask you to explain, and explain further, and explain further. So whatever is on the resume, there should be a story behind it. So the STAR method is very important in how we tell our story. Here we're going to talk about using the STAR method, which is essentially how you frame your experience. And it's simply situation, task, action, and result. So the situation is the groundwork. It's the foundation of your story. You're giving the reader a sense of the environment or the conditions or the project that you were a part of. It lays the groundwork. It's an introduction. But then you quickly move into the task that was assigned to you, the action that you took, and the results. So the most important aspect of this is as you craft your experience, many students forget to highlight the transferable skills from the experience. They simply write out what they did. But what we want to know is how you did it. And the trigger there is after every sentence in your resume, can you write the word by, or requiring, or involving, or resulting in? That, by doing that, you will be able to display or to convey the how. The how is the transferable skill that the employer will pay for. Because even if you're coming from a different industry, it's the skill that they're paying for. Make sure the resume reflects the skill. And by addressing those, those four options, by, requiring, involving, you'll share with the employer what they will get if they bring you on board.
If I was promoted during the time I stayed in a company, but the first position is not relevant to the position, how should we include it? I don't want them to think I worked at the last position the whole time.
So, you want to be honest, but you don't have to give as much attention to that earlier position that was not important. So you might give it one bullet point of work experience or accomplishments under it, but spend the majority of the time in the role that you were promoted into, and indicate that you were promoted, and indicate the time frame in which you were promoted. So there's a way to show that that position was an entry-level position that got you in the door, but you quickly proved your worth and were promoted. Things to consider in the situation, in the STAR model. And these are achievements, these are accomplishments, these are results of your efforts. Did you reduce time? Did you reduce costs? Improve productivity, increase sales, market share, implement a program, identify new markets, demonstrate leadership skills. I could go on and on. There could be many, many more of these. But these are elements that will allow you to demonstrate where you've made a difference in the firm, where you've made some accomplishments that added value. And I think that's what employers are looking for today. How will you add value? How have you added value? So here's an example. The first situation, customers complained that the software was difficult to install and instructions were not helpful. That's what I want you to do. I want you to think about an experience and just write down the situation. You're on a project team, write out that experience when you were on a project, the role that you played on the team. Action. You collaborated with an R&D team to develop a more user-friendly installation package. You established a hotline to take complaints. You purchased software to track the complaints and leading to a resolution. So that was the action that you took. Now you're going to craft your own experience, but you're going to clearly be able to identify what the situation was, the action that you took. Now notice there's not a lot of wasted words in that. The one way I think for you to develop a concise resume is to think about being charged for every word you put on the page. And if you would charge money for every word on the page, you're going to be much more careful about being succinct and concise. Lastly, the result. A decrease in customer complaints from 100 to 25 per quarter. Okay, so we framed out the situation, the task, the action, the result. Now we want to condense it into a bullet point. And the resulting accomplishment statement is below. You could combine it into a single bullet point if you wanted. I broke it into two. But notice that it captures the information above in a more succinct way. Try to do that with every meaningful accomplishment that you wish to include on the resume. And only include those experiences that you know that employer would be interested in. If there are tasks that are repeated, don't repeat them. For example, if you have 5 years of work experience and your first year was highly administrative, don't include those administrative tasks in the more recent work. Only enter it earlier in your career. So again, we want to show to the reader that there's progression, that as you grew within the organization or as you grew to new organizations, you took on higher level roles, higher level accomplishments. As we move to the bottom of the resume, skills and interests / additional, but it could also be certifications, it could be awards. You could title it differently. Here, I simply framed it as additional. Notice I led with languages. I led with software skills as well, certifications. Now, I've noticed that many students will put down their hobbies, reading, walking, fine dining. Honestly, don't put them on. That, I don't think, sheds enough light on who you are as an individual. It doesn't enhance your candidacy as a potential employee. I intentionally added the last bullet there. Completed 6 marathons on 4 continents. Now, very few people have done that. But it does shed some insight into the type of individual who could do that, the type of training, the type of determination. Again, it helps tell a story. If you have a very unique hobby, put it on because it's interesting. But if it's not unique and it's not something that you could talk about for 10 minutes, don't put it on. An important point here about the software skills. You see them listed at the bottom. Honestly, if I took a course in R, I would put it on the bottom of my resume, even though I practically failed the class. More importantly, if you have a strong competency and a skill, make sure it's elevated into the body of the resume. Try to incorporate these skills in your accomplishments, in your achievements. Now, many of you may have gleaned these skills only from a class, and that's appropriate to put at the bottom. But if you've used the skills on the job, it is much better to put them in the body of the resume than at the bottom. Questions?
Yes. If we're in the middle of a project, could we put it in the resume? It will be completed by the end of the year.
Absolutely. Currently, use terminology that would indicate to the reader that you're in the middle of the project, and use the appropriate dates.
How wide could the resume be? For example, for a position like a supply chain executive, because you mentioned we need to be specific for a role. But what is the best level of specificity?
The best level of specificity is going to be dependent upon the role that you're applying for. You know, again, you're going to have several different resumes. You have a resume that's very, very specific because of whatever reasons. You're going to selectively pull information from that resume so that it doesn't position you as being overqualified for the new role or underqualified. So it's a judgment call for you to package yourself in such a way that the new employer is going to be convinced that you can do the job. So it is difficult to craft a resume without understanding the role that you're applying for. That's an important distinction to make. The more you know about the role you're applying for, the more compelling your resume will be. For example, if you're applying for the job you currently have now at a competitor, your resume would be amazing because you know the role. So my suggestion is to develop that understanding of the role in a new organization before you craft the resume. Final product, have your name in the file name, kind of goes without saying, just so it's not, the file name isn't resume, because there's 1,000 of those and it'll get lost. Spell check, different ways to make sure that it is absolutely bulletproof in terms of accuracy. Sometimes spell check actually doesn't catch certain words. I think perhaps especially the bolded all caps titles. I can't tell you how many times I've seen typos in resumes, and there's nothing worse. So please spend a tremendous amount of time sharing it with others to have others take a look at it. Also share with practitioners in the field. As you're doing informational interviews, it's certainly appropriate to say, would you mind taking a look at my resume? I'm hoping that it captures the skills and the competencies that your field might be looking for. I think people love to give feedback on their resume. Just as a cautionary note, if you ask 10 people to comment on your resume, you'll get 10 different suggestions. So at some point, you're going to be perfectly fine with the resume. You're going to feel it accurately and positively captures the essence of who you are. But it doesn't hurt to get 10 different impressions and feedback. Track the resumes that you send. Many of you could be sending out 3 or more versions of the resume, so keep a file. When you send it out to IBM, it's IBM resume that you've labeled in your file. So when you do get called in for the interview, you're printing out that copy of your resume, not the copy you sent to another firm. And as you do attend an interview, bring several copies of the resume. So if there's, obviously there may be some questions here, and I'm sensitive to time. I will move on. I'll take questions, obviously, but I will move on to cover letters, which I think are important as well. Cover letters, I often say, they're a very important part of the toolkit. They, I think, more effectively help you tell your story, but they have a tremendous amount of downside risk. I'll almost go so far as to say 99% downside risk, because it gives insight into your writing skills. And to craft a very compelling cover letter, you need 3 things. It has to be the right format. It has to look professional, number 1, formatting. 2, it has to have content that is relevant, content that is rich. And 3, it has to be bulletproof grammatically, sentence structure, diction, spelling, and so forth. So there's a lot of risk to creating a perfect cover letter, but we're going to work on that right now. But honestly, it can be very effective because many employers believe that clarity of writing equals clarity of thought. If you can write well, you can think well. If you can't write well, I might question your ability to, to handle more complex tasks. But it's the bridge between the job and the resume. It helps tie the story together. It's an opportunity to be persuasive, but like the resume, it is very targeted with only the most relevant information. And the purpose is the same as the resume, to get the interview. So the format, a business format, we're going to talk about that. Professional looking, very different than what you might correspond through email. A single page, never more than a single page. Generally 3 paragraphs or 4 if you have some very relevant content. And again, a conservative font of 11 or 12. Here's an example of a cover letter. Take a moment to read it. I didn't make it complete. because there's an opportunity here for readers to add their own detail. But notice that it's left aligned. The address at the top, 100 Main Street, that's your address. Notice your name is not at the top. It's only your street, city, state, and zip. That's your address. 2 spaces lower, today's date. 2 spaces below that, full contact information on the individual and the organization that you're targeting, followed by the name of the individual. And now we begin. First paragraph is generally who, what, why. Who's writing? What are you applying for? And why? Succinctly, why should I keep reading? Why is this position of interest to you? Show me the hook. Second paragraph is where you go into the detail to build on that why. Go into more detail. Share with me the reasons why you're the perfect person for the role. And the third paragraph is thanks. Different ways of writing thank you. But again, the most difficult paragraph to write in the cover letter is the middle paragraph, where you're tying in the needs of the employer with your experiences. So let's take a look at this. Generally, the hook and the why are the most difficult. The why should be specific. Because you possess 7 years of consumer packaged goods experience, you have 5 years of operational experience working in a manufacturing environment. Again, very specific experiences that would get the reader's attention. If you've worked in their industry, if you've worked for a brand name organization, highlight it in the first paragraph. If you were referred by someone within the organization, that should be in the first line. And that person should be copied at the bottom of the letter. A hook might be, I read with interest your recent launch of a new product. If you're telling the reader that you're very current on their organization, that you're aware of what's going on in the industry, all of a sudden, this is not a generic cover letter. This is one that shows insight and interest in the organization, and that's what employers want. But ultimately, they want someone who can do the job. Employers want an individual who knows what's on the desk. It's your goal in the letter to show that you know what the role requires. So you have hopefully identified those core competencies and skill sets in the job description, or perhaps from speaking to people who are in the role and incorporating those into that most important second paragraph that says, in my current capacity, I have achieved, I have completed. Going into detail, make it easy for that recruiter to highlight in the cover letter those experiences and skills that you know they need. And the third paragraph is reiterating your interest in a very professional way, summarizing perhaps the 1 or 2 or 3 most important attributes that you possess, and then indicating whether or not you'll follow up. Not everyone chooses to follow up or is able to follow up, but I put that in the letter as an example. Questions on cover letters?
Yes. How common are cover letters?
It depends. Some companies, particularly organizations in the US that are, in my experience, are less task-based, that might be very heavy with client interaction, cover letters tend to be more important because communication skills are important. Generally, individuals who are in a technical role, where employers are looking for very specific technical skills, they place much more emphasis on the resume, on having those technical skills, than they do on the soft skills. But in roles where soft skills are important, in business development, maybe in communications of different sorts, the cover letter will be required. Professional services is a relationship business. Consulting is a relationship business. Those will oftentimes require cover letters.
And now the next questions, they're for the resumes again.
Yes.
Not for the cover letter. Regarding languages, I have learned 4 languages, but one of them is still in process. Should I include it?
I would include it because it does show effort, and there are different ways to sort of classify your familiarity and your competency in the language. But you may put beginner or intermediate, advanced, fluent, bilingual. So there's different ways to characterize it, but I would absolutely include it.
Is the number of team members something important to be reported and included on the resume?
It absolutely is. It's a great opportunity to quantify the size of the organization or the project that you are part of. So I would absolutely do it.
How do I include volunteering experience?
Volunteering is generally included at the bottom of the resume under other activities. Now, there are many individuals who have had some significant experience through their volunteer activities. They may have led projects, they may have led teams, they may have coordinated some very complex undertakings. So it's a way to truly, again, share the transferable skills that are relevant.
And for a person with 10, 15 years of experience, is it fine to have a resume that's longer than 1 page?
Absolutely it is. Particularly if you're keeping an eye on the relevancy of the roles. Now, you may have had a role that is very different than the one you're applying for, and it was 15 years ago. In that case, I would just list the employer, list the title, and maybe put 1 bullet point. But there's no need to go into detail if it's not relevant to the next position. I would add it on the resume, however, because it does show that you did work there. It shows accuracy. It's complete.
Mm-hmm.
But for the resume book, we are only asking one.
That's true. Yeah. For the resume book, even if you have 15 years work experience, we're keeping it to 1 page. So you have to be very selective in how you frame this resume. But it can be done. Many students are able to come to the realization that that is not important. I can eliminate that. I can take that off and highlight what's relevant. Other questions?
We have one. I believe we may apply the resume standard that you are providing us to our LinkedIn. Is my assumption correct?
To LinkedIn?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. But the LinkedIn is an opportunity to share a little bit more about your personality. So you'll notice that the resume that I've presented is very formal. The LinkedIn profile doesn't have to be as formal. Obviously, it has your photo. It has a professional looking picture, but it gives you some flexibility to talk a little bit about your interests and about your goals. And so it is less formal, but certainly take from your resume and selectively put some of that into your LinkedIn profile. I don't think you need to put everything into your LinkedIn profile, however. That's an important distinction. I really don't see a need for that.
So far, we don't have any more questions. So,
well, I look forward to seeing everyone in July. It's going to be great to have you up here. We've got a workshop that we'll do on interviewing, and thank you for the chance to speak with you today.
Yes.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in July. We're excited for all the events coming up.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Ileana. Thank you very much to Len. And thank you very much, guys. We hope that you enjoyed this session. I think that this is going to be super useful for you. You were very active, very participative. So thank you very much for that. And remember that this is going to be the first of a series of different webinars that we're going to have. So see you next week. And please continue working on the GCX.
Take care. Bye, guys.
Okay.